Hello, my name is Kristin Salazar. For my inquiry brief, I researched peer assessments and performance in high school literature studies. I am a teacher in a private K-12 school. My target group for this project included 25 high school students enrolled in the mainstream and honors English classes I teach. This group included 17 males and 8 females, 9 students on the autism spectrum, and 4 students who are diagnosed with dyslexia. I noticed that my students had a significant lack of participation in novel studies, meaning students were not reading the assigned pages prior to class, were unable to participate in class discussions, and regularly turned novel work in late. This lack of participation became a big issue. While I've tried different things to increase participation and student performance in the past, like student choice or different mediums, for my project this semester, I wanted to explore what factors might increase students' performance, including their preparedness, engagement in discussions, and quality of work. To examine what factors lead to improved student participation and overall performance as it relates to novel studies completed in small groups during class time, I worked to answer the question, does student performance on individual and group work differ when peer assessments within small groups are utilized? I chose to conduct a mixed method study that included several data collection tools, including surveys, formative assessments, a final summative assessment, and field notes. The students were randomly assigned to groups of 4 to 5 students reading the same novel. Those groups were then randomly assigned to complete the peer evaluation survey or complete the work without the survey component. The groups met 3 times a week for 2 weeks for a total of 6 meetings, with the experimental group meeting 1 additional time before the group sessions started for a peer evaluation training. After each small group meeting, students in the experimental group filled out a peer evaluation survey via Google Forms. The survey consisted of 2 categories, involvement and quality of work. Each of the 2 categories was broken down into specific items on a rubric. Students evaluated each person in their group on a scale of 1 weak to 5 excellent. In addition to the 5-point scale, there was also a comment section where students were required to explain their scoring. At the start of the next class, prior to meeting in groups again, students received their personal results of their peers' evaluations. All peer scores and comments were given anonymously. Students in the control group met each session but did not complete peer surveys or receive peer feedback. During these 6 group sessions, students completed individual and group tasks. First, students took a 5-question quiz about the reading content prior to meeting in groups. Then, within their groups, students completed a formative task involving a key literary skill, such as symbolism, character, or tone. That work completed during these group discussions are also what students based their peer evaluations via surveys on. At the end of the 2-week sessions, students individually completed a final summative assessment on the novel. It consisted of 30 multiple choice and short answer questions about literary elements significant to the book. My inquiry question analyzes the impact of peer assessments during small groups on student performance. The survey data and formative assessments were relevant data points for this question. I looked for changes in student performance on individual formative assessment scores and group work, as indicated from the surveys conducted after students received the initial results from their peers' first evaluation of them. Specifically, I looked for overall trends to see if peer assessments caused deviations in daily reading quiz scores, indicating that students were reading the assigned pages each day or not. I also looked to see if student performance within small groups changed, as indicated by any differences in peer assessment scores for involvement and quality of work. A change in score on the evaluations would show whether students take a more active role within their small groups because of the peer evaluation component. I also compared these scores to the control group of students that were completing the same work and meeting within groups without peer evaluations to see if these trends can be attributed to the peer evaluations alone. Before I begin my findings, it is important to note that because of a widespread virus, my experiment had significant absences. There was incomplete data points from 13 out of the 25 students. 9 of those students were a part of the control group. First, I analyzed the quiz scores and found that the control groups were lower than the experimental group, which included a wide range of scores. The experimental group's first quiz, prior to meeting within groups and completing peer evaluations, had an average score of 4.15 out of 5. After their initial group meeting, their average scores actually decreased to 3.77 for the next 2 quizzes, and the quiz scores rose slowly to 3.85, 3.92, and a final maximum at 4.5. The control group had lower overall scores. The average of the first quiz score was 3.22 out of 5, followed by a decrease to 3.88, an average maximum of 3.50, a dip to 3.14, slight rise to 3.20, and a final minimum in the final quiz at 2.70. Next, I looked at the scores on the summative assessments completed in group sessions. These were again graded out of a score of 5. There were slight differences between the summative assessments of the control and experimental groups. Here, the differences were mostly minute, less than 0.16 of a difference between the two groups, slightly favoring the experimental group in the first and third session scores. During the second week, these differences increased slightly, with the control group actually scoring higher than the experimental group in sessions 4 and 6. During session 3, there was no difference from the first session. In the second week, the average scores favored the control group twice and the experimental group once. I also looked at the final summative assessment scores, finding that the experimental group scored higher on the final test than the control group. The control group scored an average of 76.17 out of 100 points, while the experimental group scored an average of 89.62. Finally, I analyzed my field notes in conjunction with the peer survey data. The peer evaluation surveys were inconclusive. Overall, it was interesting to see how students used the rubric, or in many cases, ignored the rubric. Across the board, students would often score a peer in their group a 4 or 5 out of 5 on quality of work, but in the comments would write about how that peer had not read the required reading or was not prepared to help answer questions. Because the rubric indicated that a student who showed a complete lack of understanding of the reading should earn a 1, the rating did not accurately reflect the rubric criteria. This happened in the case of 14 out of the 58 surveys. There were also discrepancies within individual students' feedback. One peer would rate a student a 2, while another student in the group would rate that same student a 5. This happened in a total of 8 evaluation reviews. Survey data did not always accurately depict the individual's work in group sessions. Many past research studies, like those seen here, indicate that peer evaluations have a positive correlation to student participation and assessment scores. My data did not support these claims. What was interesting to see was that the gap between the average quiz scores of the control group and the experimental group actually decreased from quiz 1 to 3, indicating that the peer evaluations were not causing any positive effect on the quiz scores. Because the experimental group's quiz scores were always close to their average of 4.00 and the control group's quiz remained close to their average of 3.07, I do not think the quiz scores showed any real changes caused by the peer evaluations. This lack of any change was also reflected in the summative assessments, which showed no difference between the first and third session scores. The students first received peer evaluations prior to taking quiz 2. While there might not have been time to rectify a lack of preparation before the second session, there definitely would have been time to make changes by session 3, which actually showed the least amount of difference between the two groups' quiz scores, with an average difference of 0.27 and a minimal difference between formative evaluations. If the evaluations had shown an impact, I believe the gap would have instead significantly increased between the two groups in these scores. The final assessment did show a significant average difference of 13.45 points between the control and experimental groups. However, it is worth noting that the control group's quiz scores were continually lower than the experimental group's quizzes. The experimental group scored from 0.27 to 1.84 average points higher, or between 4 and 37%. I'm not exactly sure what caused the difference between the two groups, but it could possibly be the widespread absences in the control group specifically. Because of the lack of differences between any of the assessment scores, I do not think the research showed any significant impact of the peer evaluations. Moreover, the peer survey data showed great inconsistencies. Most of my pre-project research dealt with college students and AP-level high schoolers participating in peer evaluations. In these studies, evaluations often matched teacher ratings and displayed both high validity and reliability. The data from my study did not correlate to this line of thinking. I was often confused at student ratings because almost a quarter of the surveys submitted did not align with a given rubric. In another 14%, students had vast discrepancies between the raters. While the students in the experimental group did receive a training session on the rubric, the overarching feeling from my field notes, combined with the survey data, showed this group of high school students did not always use the rubric effectively to complete their peer evaluations. This might have had an impact on the results of the experiment. As an educator, one takeaway from this project is that the aspects of training prior to implementing peer evaluations is key. While I conducted a short session, if I were to redo this project, I would spend more time training the students using the rubric. It might be helpful to include more examples and non-examples, or complete a model with students on different scenarios. This could increase the reliability of scores, which, in turn, might have made a difference on academic performance. It could be that high school mainstream or honors level students do not exhibit the same ability to accurately assess peers as pre-college or college level students in prior research studies. It could also be that a stomach bug hindered my ability to see the full picture of the research project. While past research supports the idea that peer evaluations are useful and increase motivation and performance in the classroom, I saw no difference in student performance on individual and group work when peer assessments within small groups were utilized. Thank you for tuning in to my final inquiry project.